Hey everyone, welcome back to Help for Docs. I'm Tony, and my job is basically being the person who catches the gap between what happened in the room and what ended up happening on the claim. And excuse me, I forgot to put my headset all the way on, so let's do that. Okay. So this channel covers CDI, medical coding, HCC risk adjustment, and revenue cycle education for providers, coders, CDI specialists, and clinical documentation professionals. And today we're talking about something that doesn't show up in a code book, but it does show up in every chart you've ever reviewed, theoretically. Implicit bias in the clinical narrative and what it's quietly doing to the HCC risk adjustment accuracy. So to keep the lawyers happy, a quick note before we get into it. Remember, the videos for education only. It's not legal advice. It's not official coding compliance guidance. Requirements from CMS, AHIMA, AAPC, and ACDIS do change, and you know this, so please verify anything that you hear today against the current guidance before you apply it in your own organization. You may be watching this video weeks, months, years down the road, so you want to make sure what you're taking action on is up to date, okay? Okay, so this number stopped me in my tracks when I first read it. 2.54. That's how many times higher the odds are that a Black patient's history and physical note contains at least one negative descriptor compared to a white patient, even after researchers controlled for the clinical picture. And this is from a health affairs study published in 2022. So think about this for a minute, because if the language clinicians are choosing to write down is already shaped by bias before a coder ever gets to the chart, what do you think happens to the diagnosis that never got documented thoroughly enough to support an HCC in the first place? So that's kind of what I want to dive into today. Implicit bias in a clinical note actually look like? So rarely is it something that's overt. It's like credibility language, phrases like patient claims or poor historian. They plant a small seed of doubt about what the patient reported. It's negative descriptors, words like non-compliant or difficult, that are applied unevenly. So also things like vague specificity, where a condition gets named, but it's not detailed enough to meet the meet criteria. And then even worse is flat out omission, where a condition that is actively being managed just doesn't even make it into the note with the same thoroughness that it would for another patient. So none of this usually happens on purpose, and that's what kind of makes it more dangerous. It's actually invisible unless you're out there looking for it. Okay, I don't want you to think I'm just making this up, so let's take a look at the research behind it. A team of researchers analyzed over 13 million clinical notes that were written about more than 1.5 million patients. So it's a pretty thorough study. It's across 5 hospital health systems between 2016 and 2023. And they specifically looked at language either undermining or supporting a patient's credibility. So what they found were notes written about Black patients having significantly lower odds of containing credibility supporting language than notes about white patients. And this is an odds ratio of about 0.82. Asian patients were actually showed higher odds than white patients. And this pattern held up even after adjusting for clinical factors. So what does all this mean? Because stigmatizing or skeptical language has been shown in prior research to shape how the next clinician reads the chart. So this is why we're concerned about this. And skepticism doesn't get coded. It's just quietly suppressing how much documentation depth that patient's conditions are getting moving forward. So here's how it actually becomes a problem with your coding and ultimately revenue integrity. And we'll look at the steps. The first one is that the bias enters the note. A condition gets described with less certainty, less specificity, or it just doesn't make it into the assessment. And then secondly, meet criteria isn't met. Without clear language showing the condition was monitored, evaluated, assessed, or treated, that condition can't support an HCC, no matter how real it is clinically. We know this. The third one, the RAF score understates the risk. That's a result of the underdocumentation. So the patient's actual chronic disease burden isn't reflected in their risk-adjusted payment. And it's not reflected in whatever care management or outreach programs are using that risk score to flag these high-need patients. And then the fourth thing is the disparity compounds. So next year's visit starts from the chart that's already underselling this patient's complexity. And this is where we're starting from. The whole cycle is just going to repeat itself year over year. I want to remind you, this isn't theoretical. This isn't me throwing out something I believe. I want to show you why this is not hypothetical, because we've already watched a version of it play out at a massive scale. There was a widely used population health algorithm designed to flag the sickest patients for extra care management. It used prior healthcare cost as a stand-in for health need, which might sound reasonable on paper. But the problem was that historically less money had been spent on treating Black patients for the same level of illness. So the algorithm, unfortunately, learned this. It learned to underrate them. And researchers found that patients who were assigned the exact same risk score, the Black patients had on average a 26% more chronic illnesses than the white patients. So that was from a 2019 science study by Obermeyer and colleagues. So the lesson here for outpatient CDI is the same principle. Just playing out one sentence at a time instead of looking at the entire algorithm. So whatever the input reflects, the output is reflecting back. Okay, so the cost-based model was skewed by unequal spending. A narrative-based risk score can be skewed by unequal documentation. So where do we come in as CDI and coding professionals? So I'd encourage some habits to build. The first one would be query for specificity every single time and treat vague or credibility questioning language as a query trigger instead of regardless of whose chart it's in. Okay. Next one is audit your language patterns, not just your code accuracy. Periodic reviews of stigmatizing or credibility undermining terms by patient demographic can surface bias that a code level audit will never catch, because the code might still be technically correct even when the language around it isn't. And then the third one, standardize your exam and history templates. Structured prompts leave less room for unconscious word choice to creep in. And fourth, bring this into your physician education. Most clinicians using this kind of language are not doing it deliberately. So in my experience, just naming the pattern and providing the data behind it is often enough to start seeing changes in that. So if you take anything from this, take this. Accurate risk adjustment was never purely a coding problem. It's a documentation integrity problem, and documentation integrity includes whose story gets told in full and whose gets told in shorthand, we'll say. So every specificity gap that you close, every query you write when something reads as vague or dismissive is a small correction to what seems to be a much bigger pattern. So that's the work ahead of us. And I think that it's very important not only to retrain the algorithms accurately, but just to retrain our providers to have these good habits. So, and if you are a provider, just have some self-awareness about this. So, with that, we'll go ahead and close. I want to thank you once again for watching and joining me today. And here are the sources where I cross-checked the information I've given you today. You can see these are all peer-reviewed and publicly available if you want to read the full studies yourself. And I'd encourage you to do so, especially the health affairs and science pieces of that. And as always, I request your support in helping me to get this information out to all of our healthcare people out there in the world. But if you specifically need help auditing your maybe your outpatient CDI program, or building out an HCC risk adjustment training or program, or putting together any kind of physician education on any of this, you're welcome to reach out to me and find me on helpfordocs.com with the contact form. And once again, thanks for being here, and I hope I see you next time.